Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. I'm very happy to welcome back longtime esteemed veteran of the event space, Autumn Schrock. Autumn, what's going on? How you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's always great to see you here. We always have a great time when you're joining us. So we're really excited today to be talking about chasing the Aurora Borealis. There you go. I got it. I didn't mess it up. I'm really happy about that. so we're going to be talking about that today. Really excited to see what you have to share. Want to give a huge thanks to our sponsors for the event, Sony, for setting this up as always. For anybody who's joining us here on Zoom, please go ahead and get any questions you may have in to Autumn, and we'll get those answered towards the end of this. You can use the Q&A tab in there as well, Facebook, live stream, YouTube, all of that jazz. If you want to go ahead and enter any of those questions in the comment section, we'll make sure to get them forwarded as well and get them answered as best we can. Otherwise, I know you've got a great presentation planned for us today, Autumn, so I'll hand over the mic to you. Thanks again for being here, and I'll see you in a little bit.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's Aurora season, finally. I'm so excited to be here to chat with you about all things Aurora. It is my favorite thing to shoot. And if you're here, you clearly love night photography or you're interested in learning more. So you're at the right place. I'm so excited to talk about Aurora. I could talk about it all day long, but we don't have that much time. So let's jump right in. So today we'll be talking about how to best predict, chase, and capture the Aurora, and give you some tips and tricks on, how to maximize your chances. So, all right, let's get started. So the first thing, to best predict the Aurora, just right off the bat, it's important to have an understanding of what exactly the Aurora is. So just really quick Cliff Notes version. The lights that many of us know as the northern and southern lights are formed by particles that stream into Earth's atmosphere from the sun's solar winds, and they collide with molecules in Earth's atmosphere. And so when these particles collide, they release energy, and that energy is seen as the glowing light that we know as aurora. So they stream into the atmosphere at about 65 degrees north and 65 degrees south. And that's why the aurora is only visible at the north and the south poles. And that's thanks to Earth's magnetic field. But they come in very different colors. You've probably seen the most common color that's green. It's like a greenish blue hint, kind of like a blend of what I've got behind me here. And the different colors that are seen in the aurora is just from the different molecules colliding with those electrons. And you can see reds, you can see magenta, you can see blue and violet, even yellow. And sometimes you can see sort of a blend of all of them together. And it's just absolutely incredible. I think anyone who has witnessed the aurora would probably tell you it's one of the most magical sights that they've ever seen. I know it leaves me speechless every time I get to see it. And if you've yet to witness it, I highly recommend that you bump that up to the top of your bucket list because it's just unbelievable. So things that I take into account for when I'm preparing to shoot the aurora. There are several different things to sort of, like I said, maximize your chances of seeing the aurora. And first thing is making sure that you're in the right place at the right time. So like I said before, since the aurora is only visible at around the North Pole and the South Pole, you need to put yourself in the right place. So either if you're looking for the Aurora Borealis, which is the northern lights, places like Alaska, Canada, Iceland, Greenland, Scandinavia, like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia. And then for the southern lights, which are called the Aurora Australis, think like Antarctica, South Georgia Island, Tasmania, and even the South Island of New Zealand sometimes. So That's the right place and then the right time. A lot of people think that the aurora only happens in the wintertime, but it actually occurs all year long. It's just not dark at the poles in the summertime. And the sunlight is significantly brighter than the aurora glow. So it's only visible from about fall through spring. I kind of generally think the fall equinox through the spring equinox. And so putting yourself in the right place at the right time just automatically increases your chances significantly of seeing the aurora. And then next would be weather. Most astrophotography is dependent on our weather here on Earth. And if you have cloudy skies, you're not going to see the aurora. So definitely, I recommend downloading the app Windy. It's either a phone app or you can see it on your desktop as well. But it's, I think, probably the most accurate app that I've found yet. And that's kind of saying something when it comes to a lot of weather predicting apps, because not a lot of them are, I at least find, to be super accurate. So definitely download Windy. Not only can you see like a Doppler radar where you can kind of see precipitation throughout the day, but you can also see wind speeds, you can see high clouds, low clouds, fog. It's really a powerful tool, specifically for landscape photographers and while shooting the aurora. Next would be the moon phase. I think also a lot of astrophotographers tend to shy away from having any moonlight at all. But with the aurora, it's actually a somewhat important element to have a small amount of moon. So when I say a small amount, I mean like 40% maybe and darker. So kind of around that quarter moon and darker. And the reason for that is when you're in these places like the Arctic or the Antarctic in the winter, there's going to be snow, right? Snow is white and incredibly reflective. So anytime you've got this light, the aurora is glowing over this white snow, it kind of just casts a green shade over everything. And I've got a photo here I can pull up, just show you an example. So you can see the aurora is happening. There's a little bit of cloud coverage there, but the foreground is basically just all green with the aurora. And while that is totally fine, and obviously photographing the aurora is subjective, and if you like that, awesome. But with that being said, it does kind of blend in a little bit too much, I think, for my personal liking. So even something like a little bit of city light can even add something like this shot here. You get that separation of the foreground and the aurora just by adding some sort of light source that helps to illuminate that mountain in front. And I think, it can be the moon, it can be lights. A lot of city lights tend to be a little bit orange. So I tend to shy away from relying on any sort of city light over a moonlight, which is very neutral. But it just helps to neutralize that foreground so that you have more of a white snow instead of a very green kind of muddy snow. You can definitely, edit that in post, but it's not quite the same as actually illuminating it. And an example here would be this shot where I have the moon actually in the photo, and that's obviously not a requirement. Sometimes the moon can be a little bit too bright for that, but I think this goes to show just how bright the aurora can actually get, to have a moon in the photo with it. And I think this was about quarter moon, so it was 40-50% bright probably, and the aurora is still very clear there. So not only do I get this sort of interesting compositional element with the moon and the aurora, the moon is also sort of helping me out by illuminating some of this foreground here. You can even see in the shadows where there's still some of that green left, but it's much more minimal than that first photo that I showed.
Hey, Autumn, I'm just going to jump in real quick. Sorry to interrupt you. We're getting a little banding on the screen, which I think is maybe from Zoom. If you just unshare and reshare the screen, I think if you unclick the optimize box, it should eliminate it. It's just interfering with the image a little bit.
Oh, sure. Here, I'll try that again.
There you go.
Is that better?
Much better. Now we could see that
Okay.
beautiful image.
Oh, great. Were the other ones blocked as well?
The other one had some slight banding, but it didn't interfere with the image. This one had a little bit of interference, so I just wanted to hop on, but otherwise you're good now.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for letting me know. So next up would be actually predicting the aurora. So I'll actually just go ahead and stop sharing again, but sort of sifting through data, trying to figure out when the best time to go out is and where. So I use a few different apps to do this. I find that there's not one perfect app yet, but I use a few different. One is called Aurora Alerts, and the other one is called My Aurora Forecast. And the interesting thing about the aurora and trying to predict it, it's unlike any other astrophotography element where you have no idea where it's going to be or when it's going to be there, unlike the Milky Way, where you can get, down to the second of where it's going to be and when. So you don't quite have that luxury with the aurora. And so sort of looking at predictions and trying to figure it out, kind of like weather, it's really important and key to being able to actually find the aurora. I'll go through and open up my favorite app. It's called Aurora Alerts. I guess quickly though, it's more data driven. Aurora Alerts is more data driven, and My Aurora Forecast I think is a much more visual app, and so I use them in conjunction for that purpose. So Aurora Alerts provides data directly from the Discover satellite, which is the deep space climate observatory satellite, and it monitors real-time solar winds coming from the sun about 932,000 miles away from Earth. And I think that's super cool in itself that it does that, but I'm a nerd, so I digress. But this information is really helpful for, not just scientists and, trying to figure out space weather, but also for us photographers and being able to figure out, if there's an advanced warning for maybe a storm, to say like, hey, the Discover is basically saying, go outside, the aurora is about to happen. And so here, I'll pull up this app here. And hopefully you can see that okay. The thing with this app is that it's a little bit overwhelming at first. When you look at it, it's like there's a lot of information and it's not clearly laid out as to necessarily what that information is. So really quickly, I'll walk you through it. At the top, you can choose your location. Right now, I have my location set for Tromsø, Norway, which is a little town pretty far up in Norway. So it's actually in the Aurora Oval is what it's called. And I'll explain that in a second. But below that, we've got this percentage. There's a 13% overhead and a 13% horizon. And this basically is just your percentage of seeing the aurora right now. And the reason these numbers are the same is due to that location. Because I'm in that aurora oval, which literally is an oval, I'll show you here over on the graph section. So this is looking down at the North Pole, and you can see that the aurora sort of presents itself in like a crown around the top of the globe. And so Tromsø is really far north in that oval. So it doesn't matter if the aurora is necessarily showing up overhead or at the horizon, you'll see it regardless. So these numbers aren't always the same if you aren't far enough north. Underneath that, we've got the actual solar wind data from the Discover in these little like odometer icons, which is a nice visual representation because it kind of shows you like what's really popping and what's kind of slowed down. But it gives you information now, and then you can also click a little toggle for in 79 minutes to what it's going to be. And holy moly, that third one. Okay, so back to now. What it's showing here on the far left is the speed. So it says 315 kilometers per second. And this just measures the speed of the solar winds coming from the sun. So the faster the speed, the harder the collisions will be, maybe the more collisions there will be, which will result in more aurora displays. An ambient solar wind speed is about 300 kilometers per second. So this isn't very fast. It's kind of just like a normal solar wind speed. And once you get to about 500, that's when things start to look good. The next is the BZ, and this is probably regarded as one of the most important parameters when you're predicting the aurora. BZ is the solar wind's magnetic orientation in the south to north direction. It's kind of hard to explain. It's probably one of the most complicated ones also. So if you're curious to know more about that, you can just feel free to Google it, or you reach out to me if you'd like later. I'm happy to talk science with you. The next one is, so the BZ, sorry, I went ahead of myself there. It can show aurora when the BZ is positive, but a negative BZ will actually help the solar wind grab Earth's magnetic field easier, which will result in potentially better aurora displays. So we want the number to be negative. Usually the negative, the better. So a 7 right now that it's showing isn't super ideal, but who knows, something could happen. Because that next one, density, is almost off the charts. Literally, the density just measures how dense the solar wind is. So if you think about it, more particles coming from that solar wind has more opportunity to make collisions with those molecules in our atmosphere. So we want that number to be higher. We want it to be more dense. And right now, 18, that's probably one of the highest I've ever seen it. Honestly, if I go to that 79-minute tab, I don't think I've ever seen it at 24. So right now in terms of it's, the potential could be pretty high in the next hour and a half or so. And then last we have the BT. This is kind of maybe the least important. It's still important to look at, but I think out of the 4, it's probably the one that you can maybe ignore a little bit. It just measures the strength of the interplanetary magnetic field, or it's commonly known as the IMF. But basically, again, here, just the higher the number, the better. And below that, we have the KP index. You're probably familiar with this. It stands for the planetary K index. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. Next below that, we've got weather and moon. The weather just kind of shows the cloud cover. So right now, you're not going to see any aurora in Tromsø because it is completely cloudy. But I would still trust the Windy app more than what this is saying in here. And then you've also got the percentage for the moon and when it rises and sets with the sun also. So that's some helpful information, but basically the most important info on this screen are those little 4 dials. And if we go at the bottom here, we're on the short forecast tab. If we go to the long forecast, that's where we see the KP index predictions for the next 2 days. And the KP is an interesting number because it's for some reason come to mean how strong the storm will be. And it's basically, it's a number from 0 to 9 that's determined by how much geomagnetic activity there is. So if it's a KP0, there's very low to none geomagnetic activity. And if it's a KP9, it's extremely, extremely high activity. But if you're far enough north, that number doesn't really matter. I've seen aurora displays that were a KP1 that absolutely blew my mind. And I've seen predictions for KP7 and didn't see aurora at all. So if you're far enough north, that KP doesn't necessarily matter a lot. I've got a little diagram here that I'll show that is, I'm a visual person, so it's easier for me to see something that's, instead of just talk about it. Let me see if I can move that out of the way here. So here's the map of sort of North America and a little bit of Greenland, but you can see these lines here represent the KP. So this blue one here is KP3, and then it goes down to KP5 and then 7. So say you're in like the PNW and you want to see the aurora, it's in between the 7 and 5. So it's going to have to be like a KP6 in order for you to see it. But say you're up in Alaska, maybe in Fairbanks, it doesn't necessarily matter how far south it's going to be seen because you're there, you're in that aurora oval, so to speak. Same thing goes for Europe. We've got like say in Scandinavia over here, like Norway, Tromsø is like, up here in this region. So again, that KP doesn't necessarily matter. So it is really important that you get yourself far enough north. And then the other app is called My Aurora Forecast. And again, I'm just going to show you quickly, or actually I showed you that graph with the Aurora oval. In that app, the Aurora Alerts app, it's just really far out. You can't zoom in to move it around and actually see that oval in a better representation, especially to where you are. And so the other app does a much better job of that. I'll open that now. Okay, so we've got the KP index again at the top, and then the percentage. Again, my location here is set to Tromsø just for consistency's sake. But really the only thing I use this app for is that second tab, that Aurora map. So I'll click that. And this shows me the actual Aurora oval. You can see it's this gray band that goes around. It's kind of a little bit tough to see here because there's not a ton of aurora happening right now, but this little green splotch here, that is basically where this is saying, hey, there's a chance for aurora right here. There's data that is potentially backing up that it's actually happening right now. And you'll see it's actually in Tromsø right now. But you can zoom in really far. It can actually show you, your current location. So wherever you are, you can see where you are in reference to that aurora oval. Sometimes you'll see yellows in this sort of green band to show strength. You'll see orange, red. I've even seen like a magenta color, depending on sort of how strong the aurora is. So those are the two apps that I use. Highly recommend getting both of them. They're free, or at least they have free versions. Of course, they have pro versions, but you don't really need those. They are invaluable. I mean, I think I would probably be pretty lost on a lot of my aurora chasing without all of that amazing information. So definitely, if you're looking to get out and chase aurora this winter, definitely get those two apps. And now, let's move on to gear. This is always one of my favorite parts. I'm such a gearhead. You don't necessarily need the absolute top of the line gear to get good aurora shots, but it is imperative that you have a camera that you can set to manual shooting mode so that you are controlling the exposure yourself, as well as manual focus. Obviously, the higher quality of your gear, specifically for night photography, I think the better results you'll get. I use the Sony Alpha 1, which just came out this year, and I also use the Sony Alpha 7S III or the A7S III. These two are both regarded as being like the low light legends, and they absolutely live up to that name. They're incredible in low light. The A7S III has a little bit lower resolution than the Alpha 1. So if I'm shooting something a little bit tighter in, and I know that I don't necessarily need to crop anything later, I'll shoot with this guy. And then if the Alpha 1 has about 50 megapixels, so if I'm shooting really wide and I know that I'm going to want to maybe crop in to play around with some compositions, I'll use this. Or, I'll just use both of them at the same time, one with a tight lens and one with a really wide lens. And then for lenses, it's usually preferred to have a wide angle lens with a wide aperture. Again, there's room to play here. I personally love the new Sony 14 millimeter f1.8 G Master. This thing is incredible. I'm really sad though I haven't gotten to use it for Aurora yet because it just came out at I think the end of May, which if you remember, you can't see Aurora in May. So hopefully I get to put this to good use this winter. But this is my go-to for night photography, and then also the Sony 20mm f1.8 G lens. This I have been able to use to shoot Aurora with, and they're both absolutely incredible lenses. They're really compact and lightweight, which I think is important if you're trying to travel to see the Aurora, because I live in Utah. So I think the Aurora storm would have to be off the charts in order for me to see it here. So I do have to travel in order to see it. And having this sort of compact mirrorless setup has been awesome. And then, of course, you have to have a tripod because we're shooting at night in low light scenarios. I use the Colorado Tripod Company's 2 Series Centennial tripod, and it's carbon fiber. It's the perfect balance of lightweight, but also durable. I think that's another really important thing to consider when you're traveling to have to shoot something with night photography, because when you think about it, when you're in the Arctic or the Antarctic trying to shoot the northern lights, the weather can be pretty brutal. There can be high winds, there can be ridiculously sub-zero freezing temperatures, and so having a really sturdy, durable tripod is important, but also one that's more travel friendly and lightweight. And I have found this to be sort of the perfect middle ground between the two. So highly recommend all of this gear. And yeah, let's jump into camera settings. Before you actually head out, it's easier to set your camera up when you're at home instead of outside. So go ahead, make sure that your camera is set to shoot in RAW format. So RAW over JPEG. I'm sure you've heard this before. I'm sure you're familiar, but just a recap. Shooting in RAW will give you significantly more information than JPEG. JPEG will toss out information it thinks that you don't need in order to get a smaller file size. But because we're shooting at night and there's not a ton of light, even with the Aurora, you still want as much information as possible to hit your sensor. So shooting in RAW is key. And then most cameras will give you an option to shoot in RAW, compressed RAW or uncompressed RAW. Uncompressed will give you a little bit more detail. It will also give you double the file size. So if you're short on storage, it's completely okay to shoot compressed RAW. But if you're able, I would choose uncompressed RAW. And then make sure that you are in a manual shooting mode so that you are able to control your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO all independently. And manual focus. This, I think, I always say is the toughest part of astrophotography, is trying to focus on the stars, because we're usually shooting with wide lenses, which means that the stars are little teeny tiny pinpricks. And I wear contacts. I don't have great vision, especially at night. So I also make sure to turn on focus peaking and the manual focus assist, which is, they're both on the Sony cameras. So focus peaking will take the parts of your photo or the parts of your frame that are in focus and use a color to highlight them. And so I find this really, really helpful, particularly when I'm trying to focus on the stars. And you can choose different colors. I use red because I think it contrasts really well with the white stars. And then the manual focus assist is really brilliant. Whenever you whenever you move your focus ring to try to focus on the stars, it will automatically zoom your image in either your viewfinder or your screen, whichever you're using, like anywhere. I think it goes up to like 11 times the zoom, I think. Don't quote me on that, but it's really far, so where you can actually see what you're focusing on, and it helps tremendously. So I recommend setting both of those as well. And then we've also got a shutter delay of some sort. So no matter how still and stable you think you are, even the little press of your shutter button can move your camera and cause a blurry image. So I usually just use my self timer, either like 2 or 5 seconds, depending on how windy it is or how much things are kind of moving around, to allow my camera to settle down before it actually starts exposing. So you can use a remote shutter if you want, but I usually just use the timer. And then we've also got color space. I think color space might be one of the most important factors when we're talking about shooting the aurora, because if color space can be a little bit complicated. First of all, what is it? It's basically just a specified range of colors that are able to be displayed. And so there are two color spaces that we work with on our cameras. Basically, we've got Adobe RGB and sRGB. And they're kind of similar. I usually try to relate them to like RAW versus JPEG, where Adobe RGB will give you a little bit more color than the sRGB. And I've got another photo here or diagram to show you, so it makes a little bit more sense. So the purple triangle is Adobe RGB, and then the red triangle is sRGB. So you can see Adobe RGB gives you a little bit more in the green and the blue range. And what color is the aurora? A lot of the times it's in this sort of green-blue color. So it's really, really important that we're capturing that color, more of that color that we can, by choosing Adobe RGB. And you might be thinking like, well, so Adobe RGB, I should say, first of all, is usually for print purposes, and then sRGB is everything on the web. So everything you're seeing right now through your screen is all sRGB. And so maybe you're shooting and you're like, well, I don't think I'm going to be printing my photos. I think I'll probably just, shoot an sRGB because that's where it's going to live anyway. But when you're editing, and then also for just future proofing, maybe down the line, you want to print something, you won't be able to get that information back. So it's like trying to go from JPEG to RAW. That information, once it's tossed out, it's gone. And the same thing with Adobe RGB. So you can convert from Adobe RGB to sRGB, but you can't go the other way around. So definitely set your camera to Adobe RGB. And actually getting into those settings now, like the actual exposure settings. Aperture is usually the widest for your lens. You can stop down a little bit if you would prefer for sharpness, but I've personally found both of these Sony primes that I talked about, that they're really sharp, all the way wide open. Like I haven't really seen any issues even in the corners with these lenses. So I usually just shoot wide open at, the f1.8. You can go up to, f2.8 if you need, like if maybe you're using the 16 to 35 millimeter G Master, which is another lens that sometimes I use when I'm out. F2.8 is okay. I would probably say not to go any higher than that. I think if you can stay at f2.8 and wider, that would be better. Shutter speed. This is my most changed variable. I guess I'll take this off the screen now. The aurora moves a lot faster than you think, and it also is very changing. So 1 second it'll be going really slowly, and then it'll just almost like snap and just go off and shimmer and move all around, and then suddenly you're trying to figure out your settings and trying to change things to keep up with it. So the shutter speed is definitely the one that I play around with the most. I don't go over, I think, like 4 seconds. A good starting point is usually like around the 2 to 3 second mark to see sort of how fast it's moving. I think when it was going really slowly, I have taken like an 8-second exposure, but honestly, I think that's pretty rare, which is different from, if you're photographing the Milky Way, where you're spending much more time shooting between like that 8 to 12 seconds. So it's actually a lot faster of a shutter speed than you might think. I've got some photos here I can show sort of to show the variation of the aurora. So this was taken at that 4 second, just sort of like a starting mode. And you can see it's pretty soft and smooth. There's not a lot of texture. There's maybe a tiny bit of texture down here in this corner. But overall, it's kind of just like, a green wash. So I would speed up my shutter speed there. And this one's, I think, it's also got a tiny bit of texture here, but for the most part, it's very flowy, very fluid, almost watercolory. And this is completely subjective as well. If you are trying to convey a certain emotion, you can use the Aurora to your advantage here. Use your shutter speed to sort of create that emotion. So if you want something more flowy, more maybe feminine, you would slow down your shutter speed so that you get these really smooth lines. Or you can use a faster shutter speed like this. I think this was about 1 second exposure, where you're starting to get more of that texture in the Aurora. It's less of just like a slow moving line and more of those sort of like little sharp ribbons. And obviously, like I said, it's subjective. I do both. I play around with my shutter speed anytime I'm out shooting the Aurora, because you never know what you're really going to catch. The next ISO, kind of similar to Milky Way photography, you want to keep it on the lower end. But with these, newer Sony cameras, they're fantastic at higher ISOs. So usually around the 1600 to 3200 range is, usually where I live if I'm at an aperture of, around f1.8 or f2.8. And this will vary obviously based on your scenario, but typically around that 1600 to 3200. And then white balance. So this is a raw photo that I used on auto white balance to show sort of how the Aurora can trick the camera. There were a lot of city lights over here that were pretty orange, pretty yellow, that sort of tweaked the auto white balance and made the photo a lot more yellow than it should have been. And so definitely choose a custom white balance when you're shooting. I usually do about 3700 to 4200 Kelvin. Somewhere in that range is usually pretty good. This was about 4800, if I remember correctly. So it's a little bit on that warmer end. And of course you can change, your white balance in post, but sometimes with the Aurora, it gets a little tricky. Like those greens are kind of a tricky color for our cameras and, just in editing software in general. So as true as we can get it is usually better. And that's in that cooler range. And the interesting thing about when you're out shooting the Aurora, this is a photo from one of my workshops where we were kind of waiting. The Aurora kind of started to show up in the corner. And so while you're out shooting, it's really, really important to remember to be patient. The Aurora graces you with its presence whenever it feels like it. It doesn't care how long you've been waiting. So many times you're sitting out there, it's cold, you're all bundled up and you're like, I am just ready to call it quits now because it's been 45 minutes and I'm freezing and nothing's really happening. But then 10 minutes later, it looks like this. And then if you're out driving or if you packed it up and you called it a night, you'll be so mad at yourself for leaving. So one of the most important, I think, takeaways is definitely to have patience with the Aurora. It's such a special sight that I think it's worth every second that's out there, that you're out there in the cold. So be patient. Yes. And then once it sort of looks like this, this is when those collisions are really happening. Everything is kind of fast. And then kind of like when you like shock something, you get that spark and then it's gone. It's sort of similar with the Aurora, where it's sort of sparking and everything's happening. And then it sort of just fizzles out. And so this is, I think, maybe after like 2 or 3 hours of the Aurora, like really just popping off. This is sort of what happens. It just kind of turns into this glow in the sky, and it's still really interesting and it's still cool to photograph, but it's just a little bit different. And it usually signals the end of like an Aurora show. Sometimes a couple hours later, it'll start up again, but usually by that point, it's like midnight or 1 a.m. and I feel satisfied with what I've gotten for the night. So usually just call it quits after that. And I'd love to talk about some sort of compositional elements now. Whenever you're first shooting the aurora, it's so exciting that you kind of just point your camera at the sky and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And that's awesome. You should definitely do that. First time you see it, just point your camera at the sky and go wild. But then once you get more experience, you understand what the aurora is doing, how it's sort of moving. Think about your foregrounds. Similar with Milky Way photography, where you want some interesting foreground element to help take your photo to the next level. So this one here, the aurora was pretty interesting. It was like, moving a lot, but the foreground was kind of just there. There's not really anything interesting happening to sort of further the storytelling. So I recommend, thinking about your foregrounds as much as the aurora. Maybe you add a human element. This was actually a hot tub cabin, and I think I would like to live there for the rest of my life. It was literally just this little cabin that had a hot tub in it, and it was incredible. But thinking about sort of how this tells more of a story. It's not just the aurora, it's thinking about like there's human life, people living here, what is their story experiencing, living underneath the northern lights. Same thing here where you've got, sort of like a village just living in this amazing, amazing place with the aurora above it. And here you can sort of see some of those different colors that I mentioned before. There's like more of a cyan, and then you've got more of like a greenish and then a blue. And that also is something that you can use for more compelling compositions. Obviously, you can't determine that. It's more luck, what the aurora is doing, but it's definitely a good, I think, practice to just start shooting nonstop when you're there. Like when an aurora storm is happening, just keep shooting because it moves and changes so rapidly that you might miss that once in a lifetime shot. Again here, just sort of adding more of an interesting foreground where we've got like a water reflection in front of the mountains. And then you've got this kind of like peak here that sort of points up and leads your eye up through the aurora. You've got some leading lines here. The aurora makes for amazing leading lines. So sort of putting that into your thought process and into your intention when you're shooting can really help improve your shots. This is another example of sort of those different colors that you can get. We've got like a little magenta and more apparent blues coming into the greens, but then also thinking about the clouds. So normally, you'd say you don't want clouds in your shot, but sometimes they can add a lot of depth. Like we've got the water in the foreground, and then you've got these mountains that just shoot up out of the ocean. And then behind that, you've got clouds. And then behind that, sort of, you've got this aurora going off. And then stars even further in the distance. So also, not totally discounting clouds. They can definitely bring in some sort of depth and dimension to your shots. It doesn't have to be a super complicated foreground. It can be something as simple as, this is a frozen beach. So it's kind of just working more into that reflection here. And you get these little like ripples from the frozen water on the beach, and then this sort of like lone mountain that is kind of long and skinny. So it also works as sort of a leading line with your eyes and the aurora coming through here. And this is one of the most interesting things about the aurora is that it comes in kind of like curtains. So think about like a bunch of curtains hanging above you. And whenever it gets right on top of you and you can look up underneath, sort of inside of those curtains, is really, really weird, but really cool. So I encourage you also to look up, not just what's in front of you, what's happening in front of you, but definitely look straight up. Sometimes you can get this like, it almost looks like a warp speed, like Star Wars sort of a look, or like some Harry Potter spell or something. But it's really, really fascinating when you just look straight up when it's right above you. All right. And then a little bit into post-processing. I'm not going to go super in-depth here, but just sort of give you my process of how I like to edit photos and how maybe you can benefit from that. Editing can be a little bit of a touchy subject for some. I like to remind myself and others that photography is absolutely an art form. It's subjective. If you like something, that's awesome. Like, that's all that matters. So I usually use Adobe Photoshop to edit my photos. Because I like to do a little bit more selective editing, that's just a little bit easier to do in Photoshop than it is in Lightroom, but you can absolutely use Lightroom. It's something that, I don't use a ton for my Aurora just personally. That's just, my personal preference, but you can definitely edit amazing Aurora shots in Lightroom as well. It's really easy to blow the Aurora out. How I was talking about, it can change so rapidly. Sometimes you might get a shot that looks a little bit like this, where everything kind of looks pretty well exposed, but you've got these sort of bright bands of the Aurora that are now sort of blown out. And you might be able to bring some of that back in, but it's a good practice to expose for sort of the brightest parts of the Aurora. So your raw shots might look a little bit on the dark side, but again, thanks to the amazing Sony gear, it's really, really easy to pull up those shadows if you're shooting in RAW. So like this shot, for instance, it was starting to get pretty bright down here. So I slowed my shutter a little bit, I sped my shutter up a little bit. And so it looks a little bit on the dark side, but with some editing, you can bring up those shadows while also keeping those highlights from the Aurora looking great. And so a little bit of my process, or when I look at this photo, or any Aurora photo for that matter, the first thing I do before I actually get into editing is I just look at it and I wonder to myself, like, how do I wish this looked? I wish, looking at this now, I would prefer that the mountains be a little bit brighter, kind of just brighter in general. I think I'd like more contrast, in the actual Aurora. Definitely like with the sky behind here, adding a little bit more contrast there, and maybe cooling it off a little bit. So basically the first step that I take when I'm editing is I apply some noise reduction, because yes, we're shooting at night and these cameras are great, but there's still going to be a tiny little bit of noise, and that's fine. But I just like to apply some noise reduction so that everything is really smooth. I think it really lends itself to the Aurora, because the Aurora is such a fluid, smooth subject. Having a really smooth noise, I think, is important. And by smooth noise, I mean little noise. So I'll apply noise reduction using either like a topaz denoise, or you can use the built-in noise reduction in Lightroom and in Photoshop. They're both pretty good if you don't want to use a third-party software like Topaz. My next step will then be to remove anything that's unwanted. So like, I think maybe I'll get rid of like this over here in the corner. It's a little bit distracting. I kind of like the little city lights here. You can tell there's like a town off in the distance, which I think is kind of cool. But basically removing anything like, maybe you get a plane coming through your sky or something. And I'll usually just use like the clone stamp or the spot healing tool. And then from there, I'll bring up my shadows. So I'll sort of selectively edit the mountains here so that they're a little bit brighter, like here. And then I'll go through, add a little bit of contrast into the sky here and sort of behind the Aurora. And then you can see in the raw photo, this kind of has a little bit of a yellow kind of orange cast on this triangular peak in the foreground. And that's because there's a city behind me. So there's a little bit of light spilling onto it, which I quite like, but it's just a little bit too yellow. So I'll neutralize that, make that a little bit whiter, and then sort of color balance the mountains so that they're a little bit less cyan. And that's like, kind of it for Aurora. I don't think it's, you have to get super complicated with your Aurora editing just because they are such an amazing thing in itself that there's not really a lot you have to do. Maybe brighten a few things here and there, add a little bit of contrast, but um, they're really special as it is, I think. So my one cardinal rule, like if you take anything away from this webinar, I think it would be that you must take some time away from your camera and your viewfinder when you're watching the aurora, when you're photographing the aurora. Take some time to just look at it. It's just like being a spectator of the aurora itself. Just watching it with your eyes, I think, is it's like a full body experience. It feels like a spiritual awakening. I've seen grown men cry. I cry, I think, every time I see it. So you would be remiss not to allow yourself that a very special human activity of just observing it. And while I'm still learning so much about the aurora itself, the science behind it, and also how to photograph it. But hopefully this helps you on your photographic journey and gives you a good starting point of, oh, I'm here. Maybe you're going to Iceland or something, and you're like, I don't really know what to do. Hopefully this is helpful. And definitely, please remember, photography is subjective. So if you like something that I advised against, that is perfectly okay. In fact, I encourage you to experiment, play around with different settings, different lenses, different gear, and find what feels true to you. Find your voice as an artist. So hopefully this is just a stepping off point for you. And then really quickly, if you are maybe a little bit intimidated about going out to photograph the aurora at night by yourself, I do teach Northern Lights workshops every year up in Norway. So if you're interested in doing something like that and getting sort of my help on the spot, you can check that out at autumnschrock.com/workshops. Feel free to send me a message if you'd like some more information about that as well. And then also, I really want to share with you, last year, my partner, Nate Luby, and one of my friends, Austin Smith, we created a short film called Light Side Up, where we were, to our knowledge at least, the first team to send up a full frame camera rig. We actually sent up the A7S III with the 20 millimeter in a high altitude balloon to capture cinematic footage of the aurora. And you can watch that short film on Lightside or on YouTube. It's called Light Side Up. You can just search it on YouTube, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And we are actually currently doing a limited edition print run of one of the photos of one of the shots that we got from the balloon. So I've got one here. They are 11 by 17. So this was at about 112-100-ish thousand feet, I think, above the earth. And so yeah, we have 50 of these prints available. They're limited edition. So once we sell out of these, we will not be doing another run of them. But they're printed on Kodak Endura metallic paper. It's probably hard to see on this camera here, but the metallic really makes the aurora sort of shimmer, which is reminiscent of what it looks like in real life when it's shimmering. So if you're interested in snagging one of these, you can get one at autumnschrock.com/lightsideUp. And that is my plug. But thank you again so much for tuning in and watching. Again, let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer. I love all things Aurora, so I'll be happy to chat with you about anything. You can find me around the web as Otpops, and maybe someday I'll even see you out chasing. So thank you again for tuning in, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much, Autumn. If if you want to put in a good word to B&H and say, that Scott's got to go check out the Aurora Borealis, I won't stop you. Definitely, you could send some emails in yourself, and I'd love to get out there because it looks absolutely beautiful and amazing. As always, I'm sure you already know we've got a ton of great questions that are just waiting to be answered. So we'll dive right into them and get your thoughts on them. So Tanita is asking, and also Greg kind of had a similar question. If you could reiterate the apps that you use, the two apps that you had mentioned, and then Tanita was also wondering, are they available for both iOS and Android? And if they are only available on one, do you have any, recommendations for the other platform that maybe would be applicable as well?
Yeah, great question. So one of them is called Aurora Alerts, and the other is called My Aurora Forecast. And they are both available on both iOS and Android. So I think there shouldn't be any issues there since they're available on both platforms. But if you'd like a different recommendation, there are a few other apps. I don't actually know the names of them right now because they're not ones that I use, but I'd be happy to direct you if you're having trouble finding those apps.
Awesome, wonderful. So good news, iPhone and Android, we're playing nice amongst both platforms. That's always a good day and a good win. So Valerie is joining us here on Facebook. She said, hi from the Northwest Territories. Wants to know, do you typically get any hot pixels when shooting long exposure in low light?
I do get hot pixels. That's kind of something that's a little bit unavoidable at this point in our technology. It's not something that I get with the Aurora because the exposures are, between 1 and 3 seconds long. They're not that long of exposures, but definitely when I'm photographing something like the Milky Way or some other celestial object, I will get hot pixels. And there are a few different ways you can get rid of those. You can do it in camera by turning your noise reduction on. Is basically will just take a second exposure that's all black to help get rid of some of those hot pixels. I usually personally leave that off and I do it in post. You can do it in Photoshop. But it's not something that I worry too much about because they are pretty easily removable. And particularly with the Aurora, they're not really that big of a problem. So definitely not anything to worry about there, I think.
Good. So now let's jump into kind of a cold weather related question. We were talking about this a little bit before in the green room, as we like to call it, before we hopped on air. And if it isn't apparent already, I'm a big baby, even though I live in New York City and I'm supposed to be acclimated to this cold weather. But, I definitely mimic Jesse's, question and feelings. Do you ever have any issues with your electronics or any of that stuff failing when you're going out there and shooting? How do you kind of prevent that from, I know a lot of times batteries and things like that are very susceptible to the cold weather. How do you ensure that, when you go out, you're going to have a successful shoot and not have to worry about all of a sudden, your batteries just completely drained?
Yeah, that's a great question. I keep several batteries sort of on the inside coat pocket so that it's hot against my body so that those backup batteries aren't losing any juice from being cold. Definitely in the cold, your batteries will drain a little bit quicker. But with the larger, newer batteries for Sony, I haven't really noticed it being that big of an issue like the smaller batteries on the Sony A7R2 and earlier models. I definitely noticed that those lost some more juice, but these larger batteries are pretty good. I haven't actually had any issues with my camera in any cold temperature. It's been very, very cold. I think the best example I can use is that the Sony A7S III went up in a high altitude weather balloon to 122,000 feet. It is negative 100 degrees up there, and it never stopped working once. It filmed the entire thing. So I think that's a pretty good testament to how good those cameras are in cold weather. So really the only thing to worry about, I think, is that the battery situation. Just make sure to keep a few extras inside your coat so that they stay warm. And then, just swap them out as needed.
Definitely. That's actually the same way I ride the train with my camera. I actually just stuff it all into different places where you would never find it. So in case anybody tries to rob me for them, they're hidden.
Yep.
So Steve is joining us here on Zoom and wants to know, do you ever use a star tracker like Move, Shoot, Move or anything equivalent to that?
I have used Star Tracker. I don't currently own one. I don't use one a ton. It's not something that I use for the Aurora since it's moving so quickly. It's not really something that I need. But Star Trackers are really awesome. I'm looking into getting one soon, and I guess we can chat then.
We could follow up and see what happens.
Yeah.
Definitely. So now Eva's joining us from YouTube and wanted to just follow up. Can you just talk about again what lenses you recommend? 16 millimeter, 24 millimeter. What's your kind of go-to in that sense?
Yes, my two go-tos are 14 millimeters and 20 millimeters. These are both the Sony 14 millimeter G Master, it's f1.8, and then the Sony 20 millimeter f1.8 G. These are my two favorites. I think 14 can sometimes be a little bit too wide. So sometimes I'll go for the 20 over the 14, but with the Aurora, because it's such a sort of like a large display, I feel like 14 is usually a pretty good focal length. And then, you can crop in if you need, but also like a 12 to 24, Sony's 12 to 24 G Master is really awesome as well. 12 millimeters looks pretty cool in certain scenarios with the Aurora. The 16 to 35 G Master is also a really great lens. 16 millimeters, I think, is a really good focal length. You can even use something different though, like the 50 millimeter. Like I have a 55 1.8, and that's actually a really interesting lens to use for Aurora, like to get sort of like an intimate field of view. I would be really curious actually to try the new Sony 50 millimeter 1.2 G Master that just came out. I think you could get some really interesting shots with that. But usually when you're shooting at night, you're using wider lenses. So I would recommend something in the like 14 to 24 millimeter range.
Great. Now, Greg's joining us here on Facebook, wants to know, do you ever wind up using light pollution filters?
Yes, that is a great question. I didn't talk about that. I use the Colorado Tripod Company. They also they have another company called Breakthrough Photography, and they make a night filter lens night filter, and it's actually makes a pretty big difference. So yeah, when you're shooting somewhere that there's like maybe some city light, which is somewhat often with Aurora in northern Norway, a lot of little like villages around, it definitely helps to cut that sort of yellow tone of the lights. So yes, they have a night sky filter. And they also recommend it for, which is kind of relevant to now, for fall photography, because something, I don't actually know exactly how it works, but it also increases the color of fall foliage, which is interesting. So it's kind of a dual use filter. I just used it a few days ago when I was out shooting the aspens. So yeah, I would definitely pick up a night sky lens or filter.
There you go. Bang for your buck, 2-in-1.
Yep. Yeah.
So now, how do you feel about exposure stacking? Do you use it? Are you against it? What's your feelings on that?
Yeah. I exposure stack in the sense that I'm more blending, where I'll take separate exposures for maybe the foreground and then a separate for the sky. But I personally don't stack, like 15 photos together, the sort of the same scene for noise reduction. Especially for the Aurora, because it is pretty bright, and you're using sort of a wide open lens, you can usually get like a great shot without needing to stack anything, because the Aurora can get really bright. I've like literally read underneath the lights of the Aurora. So stacking isn't necessarily something I do with that, but I do play around with it with other night sky photography like Milky Way and such, but usually it's just for like blending exposures.
Yeah. So now Luann wants to know, do you use a lens heater when shooting the Aurora?
That's a good question. I've never used one. I've never needed to. I haven't had any issues, but um, for the A7S III, I guess I should say, when we put that camera up into the stratosphere, we did tape some hand warmers around it. And so maybe that did help. But on the ground, I've never had to use any. So I don't unfortunately have much to say about that. But
Yeah, no worries. Can you just repeat for everybody? They were wondering as well, the tripod that you use and also the filter company that you use.
yes, sorry, that was kind of confusing when I said that. So the tripod company is Colorado Tripod Company, and then the filter company is Breakthrough Photography.
Great. So Colorado Tripod Company and Breakthrough Filter.
Yep.
Bingo. Got it. Now, if people are looking to find more of Autumn Schrock, where can they go? How can they find you? How could they link up with you? Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. What's the best way to find your work?
Yep. All around the web, I'm on all the platforms as Pops, and my website is just autumnschrock.com. So feel free to send me a message, say, hey, I'd love to chat night photography with you.
Wonderful. Well, as always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, Autumn. We always learn a ton when you join us. So I always look forward to these sessions with you. I want to give a huge thanks and appreciation to Sony for sponsoring this event. As always, everybody at home, thank you as well for tuning in and being a part of this. This has been another rendition of the B&H virtual event.